Well, Michael, welcome to our show. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, tell us a little bit about your background. I know you're originally from Lebanon, PA, and it's amazing how many of our guests have a Pennsylvania connection. But tell us about your background.
Yeah, I am from Lebanon. Grew up there, went to Lebanon High School, but unfortunately had to transfer my senior year over to Cedar Crest. So that's where I actually graduated from. From there, I went off to a couple different colleges and wound up going into both history and biblical studies, and then biblical studies is where I sort of gravitated toward, and wound up going to grad school in a couple of places, one of which was back in PA at Penn, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I have a master's degree there in ancient history. But the bulk of my graduate training was in Wisconsin. I have another MA and a PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages from the UW in Madison. Taught a while on the Green Campus, a dozen or so years. I still teach distance ed, so I've got over 10 years in on that. But I work for a Bible software company now. We do ancient language databases. We license content from publishers. We write our own content. I do a lot of reference writing. We do a lot of video courseware. I've done a good bit of that. All sorts of different things. Within Logos, the company, supervising lots of projects that involve professors from all over the world. So I know a lot of people in a lot of places, who do biblical studies or ancient studies or Semitic languages. It's a fun academic job that doesn't require grading. So
that's
kind of
a
the best
plus.
of both worlds.
Well, it
is really.
How did you get pulled into the UFO question? Because I've seen your name mentioned in a number of books that I've read. They refer to quotes from you. How did you get pulled into the UFO controversy?
Yeah, that was because I was kind of burned out after my PhD exams at Wisconsin. The people in our department had a history of, hey, if I survive the exams, what am I doing to take a year off? And my choice for that was to write a novel. It's something I'd always wanted to do. And I figured, hey, I have a command of ancient texts and ancient languages. I've always been interested in UFO stuff. In grad school, I worked third shift, for 10 years, going through my doctoral program. I listened to Coast AM every night, and that kept me up to speed there. But I sort of had my own watershed moment in 1997 with the CNN press conference at Roswell. But I figured, hey, I got a year, or I'm going to take a year, and why don't we just throw all that in a blender and write a novel and just see what turns out? And that became The Facade. And once that was out, it got some attention. I got on Coast to Coast, real kind of funny way that happened. But once I appeared on Coast talking about the novel, and in view of my background, people started to invite me to conferences and whatnot. So I got kind of sucked into the vortex through that route, and it's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Roswell, and I know you're a speaker this year, July, end of June, beginning of July in Roswell. Mm-hmm. It's the 70th anniversary. But, I had always heard there was two conferences there. Apparently one run by Guy Malone is more from a Christian viewpoint. They have pro and con. But then you have the other one at the museum that I guess is your traditional UFO speakers. Is that how that works?
In the past, there's been two or even in some cases 3 parallel conferences. They kind of bump into each other all the time. Guy's in the past, he hasn't lived in Roswell for, past 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. So in the past, his had a Christian bent to it. This year's conference is really a good mix. There's Christians and non-Christians of all varieties. It's the docket's split up into about half. The one sort of thread running through it is kind of a critical response, or at least critical thinking, when it comes to the Roswell event and ufology in general. So this year, it's not really something that he could label a Christian event if he cared to. it's not sort of this driving thing with him to do that again.
Okay.
But there is a current that sort of runs through it.
Okay. Now, you live up in the Seattle area. Now, my experience with West Coast people are extremely gullible. They believe everything. They're metaphysical. How do you...
Oh, yeah.
I mean, how do you possibly live on the West Coast?
Well, I came out here in 2004 for the job, right after I finished my PhD. And I mean, we like it. I live actually 100 miles north of Seattle, so I'm right on the Canadian border.
Okay.
But your characterization is accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I've been to
it's kind of hippie town.
Yeah, I've been to conferences out there where people would actually raise their hand, get up and say, well, I have been to Venus, I have been to Mars, not physically, but metaphysically. And everybody would sit there. They'd sit there shaking their heads. And I'd say, what? They all believe it. They believe everything. I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, maybe we met there. We just didn't realize it.
It could be. All right, let's talk a little bit. You got a few different stances here. I want to talk a little bit about ancient alien stuff, and then a little bit about why you say Christians shouldn't be threatened by ET, and I think that's an interesting, viewpoint. But you've done some work on Sitchin, and we don't have a lot of time, only like a few minutes on each of these questions. But you talk about Sitchin a little bit, why he's wrong, and then I want to ask you about something that I discovered recently called Goetia, Goetia, and see if you know about that. But tell us a little bit why you think Sitchin was off base.
It's fine if you only have a few minutes because it really only takes a few minutes.
Okay.
I have a website, sitchiniswrong.com, and I do thrilling things on there, like make videos of me, capturing my screen, looking at primary texts to show you what they really say as opposed to what Sitchin says. So the death blow to Sitchin really is primary text along with critical thinking, and here's what I mean. I get email all the time where people think, well, Mike, you're just disagreeing with a translation that Sitchin has, and it's really the translation's kind of, controversy, something like that. And I'm like, no, that really isn't the case, because what I'm actually saying is that what Sitchin says about the Anunnaki and Nibiru can't even be found in cuneiform texts. And that's an audacious claim. So again, I make videos of myself going up to websites like the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, which anyone can access, and I show people how to do it. Here's how you type in Anunnaki and the transliterated characters. You hit the button, and you get all the places where the Anunnaki, or the Anuna is an abbreviated name, show up in the Sumerian tablets. And now all you got to do is look through the list, hit the TR, which means translate, and read it for yourself. It's over 100 times. And what you find is there is no line in any tablet that links the Anunnaki with Nibiru. Zero. Nada. Okay, there is no line that has the Anunnaki coming here in a craft or coming, to Earth in any vehicle, even creating humans. If you go to Enuma Elish, this text that people are fond of quoting, and you actually read it, the Anunnaki don't create humans. They're watching while someone else, a singular deity, does it, kills another deity and mixes the clay and the blood and all that stuff. So the fundamental claims, Nibiru does not cycle through the solar system every 3,600 years. Okay, there is no planet in Sumerian Mesopotamian astronomy beyond Saturn. All these things are just demonstrable. And so when you show people how to find the data themselves, even though it's boring, if they actually go look at it, they can only draw one conclusion. Sitchin is wrong.
Okay.
These fundamental claims are wrong.
Do you think he misinterpreted? Because obviously, I understand there's only about 100 to 120 people in the world that can decipher Sumerian. So do you think he just misunderstood it, or do you think he kind of made it be what he wanted it to be?
Yeah, I think that about Sumerian, if you're a graduate student in Assyriology, every graduate student in Assyriology has to take at least, one course or maybe a year in Sumerian. So, the numbers probably double that, which still isn't a whole lot. I think what Sitchin, I don't attribute anything sinister to him, and I've heard crazy things about Sitchin. Oh, he was an Illuminatist. Oh, he got paid by this group, that group. Whatever. I actually think he's like these 19th century alternative history writers like Theosophists or whatever. They concoct a mythology in their literary work, and then they come to believe their own myths. So I don't look at Sitchin as a sinister character. I look at him more or less as someone whose gullibility is high. I also don't think he's competent in ancient languages. I could take you to his books right now where he makes mistakes in Hebrew, like with Elohim. Yeah, it's shaped plural, but the grammar tells you it's singular. Do you know Hebrew grammar or not? He can't tell Aramaic from Hebrew. There are telltale signs of that. Anyone who's taken a first year in either language is going to know that. There are just things like this, and people get enamored because Sitchin was Jewish. Oh, he could read Hebrew. Well, yeah, sight reading. Okay, well, my kids can read English, and they can read the English Bible, but they're not good interpreters. Okay, just because you can read a language doesn't mean you know how to analyze it, especially when it comes to literature. So I question his competence, and I question, again, the gullibility factor, but I don't look at him as some sort of sinister character as some conspiracists do.
Yeah. Well, your explanation is hugely important, because I have so many people that will cite what Sitchin says, and they will tell me, I get, Fred Lane up in Erie, I get in arguments with him. He tells me the Jesus story is just a retelling of older Sumerian texts, and that Jesus was just a prophet and not the Son of God. And we get into these arguments over this. But if what you're saying is correct, then Sitchin's wrong.
Yeah, well, give me the name of the Sumerian god that died for atoning the sins of humankind. I mean, there isn't one. Yeah. So if you have a good handle on the primary text, this is why I say that the real Achilles heel of Sitchin, and frankly ancient astronaut theory in general, is primary texts. Okay. I would encourage people, if you're interested in this, don't read what somebody else like Sitchin says about a text. Go read the text. Okay. They're not hard to find. You can find them all in translation. There's no mystery, to what they say. This is publicly accessible material. But people sort of just want to believe this other narrative. They either don't like, Christianity, or they don't like creationism, or they don't like Darwinism. So this is sort of this in-between world, that allows them to, I guess, in their mind, make sense of the world and their place in it. Okay. But it's a fabrication, which is unfortunate, but that's just sort of the way it is.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Latin term goetia, G-O-E-T-I-A? It's something I discovered just a few months ago in June on my trip to Scotland and Rosslyn Chapel. Are you familiar with that, the building of King Solomon's temple through the use of goetia?
Yeah, it's a term that's related to, for want of a better term, I'll use a general one. Either magic or some kind of, magical or occultic control of demonic forces or something like that. It's not specifically exorcism. One would be a subset of the other. That kind of thing. Okay,
but what I found hugely interesting is, in my mind, extrapolating it, is if you can have a spell, and it says that King Solomon was given the spell from God to control angels and demons to build King Solomon's temple. Well, the next thought in my mind was, if they could build King Solomon's temple, then why wasn't the three pyramids of Giza built that way? Baalbek. Why couldn't all of the ancient sites that ancient alien theory talks about is built by ETs, why couldn't they have been built by ancient deities that were either controlled by us, if you had the spell, or they built it themselves for human sacrifice? And that would eliminate the ET question. I found that extremely interesting.
Well, if you make those concatenations, yeah, that would eliminate the ET question. This certainly isn't a biblical claim about Solomon's method of building the temple. Goetia shows up, and Solomonic magic, just in general, shows up in some pseudepigraphical texts. Exorcism is pseudepigraphical text, or anything that's in the Second Temple period, but in this case, probably it's all post-Christian, post-New Testament. So It's not in the biblical orbit. Exorcism is a little bit older than that. There is an exorcist tradition for Solomon that bleeds into the messianic mosaic that Jews of that period were expecting. But again, exorcism isn't really what we're talking about here. I personally think the technology to build these things is very human. I think it's been demonstrable in that case. And I'm not referring to sort of cheesy, Nova special accounts of, we can't build a pyramid, so the Egyptians couldn't have done it. Mm-hmm. When I think of this, I always think of Wally Wallington, and Wally never made a claim that the Egyptians used his method. What he was trying to do is show that this is a method they could have used. But this is the guy in Flint, Michigan, that built he built a miniature of Stonehenge in his backyard without the use of the wheel. Just with 2x4s and ropes, and he uses weight and counterweight. And for your listeners who are interested in this, it's fascinating. Go to theforgottentechnology.com. And unfortunately, you'd have to buy Wally's CD. It's only $15. He's got a couple sample videos there. But when I taught the Egyptology course here at the local university for 3 years, and I would go in every year the first day, and I would say, look, let's be honest, you're not going to remember most of what I say in here, but you better have your butt in the seats for this day, because on this day I'm going to show you something you will never forget for the rest of your life. And they'd come in, and I would show them Wally Wallington on video, home video, this guy spinning 25,000-pound slabs of concrete around, how he would erect them, how he would move them to one place to the next. He applies his technological method to moving his garage across his yard. Yeah. I mean, it's but when you see it, the thing that's stunning is how simple it is. Yeah. That you look at it and you go, why couldn't I think of that? This is so obvious how you would do this. Well, the reason is you never had the need. You never had to solve the problem that Wally did when he stumbled upon this technique. But the ancients, they're applying their own brain power and their own manpower to problems they had or things they wanted to do. Our technology proceeds in different directions. So I'm not one who believes that aliens or demons or angels or Nephilim or any of these particulars built these monuments. I think the accomplishments are very human, and they're no less stunning in that respect. Okay. But there is a Solomonic tradition, at least again for exorcism, that is biblical, and the Goetia stuff is a little bit later in late antiquity, especially the Middle Ages and Renaissance, when Solomonic magic was sort of in its heyday in the early modern period. You read a lot about it there. Yeah, and I think Aleister Crowley was the one who actually brought it up, and he wrote. Yeah, he would be deeply into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment occultic texts. Yeah, Kabbalistic texts, all that sort of thing. Okay, I got my next question, and if you could stay on, I think we're going to run this into closer to an hour program if you're able to stay on, because I got a few more questions. And sure. Okay, so my next question is, you make this quote, and I want to talk about this group called the Free Group, Foundation for Research into ET Encounters. It's the Edgar Mitchell Group. But you make this quote, ETs are perfectly able to communicate with us, but they don't. The abduction is a human rights issue and is unethical and demonic. They want us to believe that ETs are our creators and not God. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that, and then I want to talk about this Free Group that you may or may not be aware of. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if there are intelligent extraterrestrials, and I don't think we know that yet, but if there are, and I don't have any problem with there being, I think they would be perfectly capable of communicating to us, but in some means, or at the very least, learning how to do so when they got here. So there's a certain artificiality to the whole alien narrative, whether it be contactee or, especially the abduction thing. Why do they need to resort to these methods, especially if they're violent and violative, when they have the technology, presumably, to get here? You mean they they didn't anticipate having to communicate with anybody. Like, really? They're that dumb? I just don't think so. It doesn't cohere very well. So I think they'd be perfectly capable of doing this. And the fact that they're, again, whatever these experiences are, let's just, for the sake of the conversation, say, aliens. Okay, so if you have these aliens coming here, and again, they know what they're doing is causing pain. They know what they're doing is violent. Again, if they're these peace-loving and enlightened beings, either they know that, or they're really, really dumb, or they're really, really evil. So you don't have too many buckets you can put this in, and we should be trying to ask honest questions about that experience or that event, again, whatever that might be, and ethics. Okay, just the normal kinds of questions we would ask ourselves. What does it say about us if we're doing these things? Even to animals, that we're deliberately causing them harm. If you could do it, if you could get what you want in some other way, you're intelligent enough to do that, and you're not doing it. What does that say about you? It doesn't say anything good. So I think we again just need to ask some honest questions about what people allege is going on to help us think better about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's always the test, is how you treat people that are weaker than you, let's say. How do you treat children? Mm-hmm. How do you treat animals? How do you treat seniors, right? Yeah. I mean, if you abuse them, then that says a lot about you because you're the stronger, let's say. So that's the ethical test. But, mm-hmm. My next part of that question is, there's this group out there run by Renio Hernandez called FREE. It's the Edgar Mitchell mm-hmm. Group. And I have huge problems with their findings. And I disputed, and Renio and I have gotten into such huge arguments, almost threatening, where he has said to me, why are you allowed to say the ET abduction is malevolent? He doesn't even want me to say that. His findings are basically that 75% of all of the ET abductions are positive. I mean, even the 25% that are negative, well, not really negative. 9% are negative. The other 16% are kind of like not a good thing, So basically mm-hmm. saying 9% of being kidnapped, raped, and no choice to get out of it ever is a good thing. I have a real problem with this. I've gone as far as saying that this is kind of like the Condon Committee or a modern-day Robertson panel trying to give you this information that's not true to push an agenda that we should open up to these ETs. Being mm-hmm. kidnapped is a good thing. When they show up, we're going to follow what they got to say. I see a huge problem with this. I think there's a problem with his research. I think because he claims to have a positive encounter with a beam of light while he was driving in Miami, and they told him there are ETs there to help. He wants everything mm-hmm. to be positive. And I see huge problems with this. But this is being pushed by all of the abductee people. See, I told you it's a good thing.
Yeah. I think the right term for this is, if this is the wrong term, please correct me, but the Stockholm syndrome.
That's exactly what I say.
Where you begin to identify with your captors. Now, again, to be consistent with the logic, and the first thing I would ask is about the research. Well, let's see the research, and then my second question is, have you submitted it to peer review? And there are peer-reviewed journals that are friendly to this kind of research, but I mean, just in general, can you get at least a statistician or someone who's a professional in creating surveys to endorse the survey? In other words, let's probe the research itself for a little bit, but you get beyond that, and it's like, okay, let's apply the logic. So if there were enough incidents today when terrorists are abducting and doing violent things to people, if enough of those people begin to identify with the goals of their captors, i.e. the Stockholm system, then that means it's good. That means we shouldn't oppose it. That means, we should just tell people, hey, if this happens to you, you'll be able to deal with it at some point, and you'll feel better about it, and you'll understand. Really? You know, I mean, and if it holds up there, well, let's bring children into it. Why don't we do this for children? You know, after all, children, they're childlike. They're more willing, to accept this or that. You know, it's an ethical quagmire at best. And it's something that no one, I think at least in their right mind, would want to apply to other people in other situations, and of course apply to themselves or their family members. The third thing I would say is, well, isn't it kind of interesting that your research contradicts the previous 2 decades research on alien abduction, where the percentages were flipped? How did that happen? Again, I want to see the research, because this is a quite oppositional set of findings to what goes on in the previous 2 decades.
I agree with you. That's exactly what I've said. You and I are on the same page. How does
those questions are not unreasonable? Okay, and I hit people with this a lot. Look, these questions that I'm asking, I'm not asking them to be antagonistic. I'm telling you what you need to give me to win the argument. These are not unreasonable questions, so I'd like them answered.
Yeah.
That's it.
And the other thing I look at is I read Kenneth Ring's book on comparing near-death experience and alien abduction. And I did my own analysis of alien abduction and demonic possession. I found about 60% of the markers of alien abduction and demonic possession are the same. So I put them 2 in the same category, and then I look at near-death experience, and the one thing that comes up, and this is a huge marker for me, is that in every near-death experience, you were giving a choice to come back to your life or stay in heaven or wherever it was that you ended up. But in the other 2, alien abduction and demonic possession, once it starts and it's attached to you, there's no choice in ending it. In the other 2, alien abduction and demonic possession, once it starts and it's attached to you, there's no choice in ending it.
Yeah, there's no choice. Yeah.
Doesn't that tell you everything you need to know?
I think that does speak volumes. And again, a lot of people that are hearing these discussions today, they're not aware of things like, okay, the 1992 MIT conference on alien abduction. Those papers were published in a large volume in proceedings, and one of the articles there compares the alien abduction narrative to satanic ritual abuse. And it's not like there's 3 or 4 points of overlap. There's like 15 or 20. And again, if we're to believe the people who, again, have this experience, again, whatever it is, if we're to believe them, and we think they're being forthright and honest, then why would we turn our backs on testimony like that? The only answer to me is to propel a certain narrative. To put a certain spin on something, and to me that dishonors that witness testimony. So since it's so opposed, since what this group is saying is so opposed to, again, the previous couple of decades of research, I want to see the research. It's not an unreasonable question. How are you getting these results? Because they're so contrary to what has preceded them.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. All right, let's move on to the next question. And this is the important question, because I'm hosting the MUFON Symposium in Cherry Hill in 2018. And either way, we're going to get to this question, whether you speak at our Philly conference or the MUFON Symposium. And this is what I would ask, that you come in as a speaker. And the question is, you say that traditional Judeo-Christianity should not be threatened by intelligent ET reality. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, and that would be part of this conference that I'm thinking about doing, that talks about contact, after contact, what happens, and I think that view would be good. So tell us a little bit about why shouldn't religion be afraid of ETs, because the Robertson panel actually said that they saw the scientific, not the Robertson panel, the
The Brookings report?
Brookings, yeah, the Brookings report, that they saw the scientific and religious communities falling apart, where personally I think people would run to religion if these things showed up, but tell me your view.
Well, the Brookings report is pretty dated, 1960, and it did conclude that there would be a general and significant disruption on human society if there was, ET disclosure. Okay, but there have been two succeeding surveys. We had the Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey, and I realize, John Alexander's not, he's kind of a shady guy, but his wife, did it. But I understand, that you could look at Alexander in a couple different ways, but that survey asked the question: is Brookings really true? Would this really precipitate some sort of religious crisis? And it basically concluded, not so much. And the same thing with the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey of 2008. Alexander was in 1994. Peters sort of echoed Alexander in this regard, even though the questions were a little bit different. The fundamental problem, with really all of these, and I think if you're talking about sort of a mainstream question, I don't think there would be a religious crisis today. If you're talking, though, about a narrow subset of the religious world, let's just say like conservative, Bible-believing Christians, or like Hasidic Jews, or somebody that's more on the conservative side, I do think it would trouble them significantly, but it doesn't need to. That, again, this is my position, and I've given this talk in a number of places. And it typically, why people are sort of unnerved, people in that camp are unnerved by these things, really has to do with, for lack of a better term, what I sort of call biblical or theological myths. And what I mean by that is, for instance, the notion that, well, if it's not mentioned in the Bible, it can't be real. Well, okay, like toilet paper's not real, microwaves aren't real. I mean, it's this sort of, falsifiable view of the Bible that is actually contrary to what the Bible is. But people are troubled, by that, because they're taught to think about the Bible in a certain way. There's the issue of Darwinism. The ET discussion nowadays is always linked to materialistic evolution. I don't think people should be troubled. Bible believers should not be troubled by that, because there are lots of really, really serious biblical scholars, and I mean believing biblical scholars, not critics or skeptics, theologians, people who are in the hard sciences. The church I went to in Wisconsin in graduate school, we had, I think, a dozen or so faculty members from the hard sciences at the university in our church. They're all serious. They're all believers. They were elders and whatnot. But they really didn't care about evolution. Okay, and personally, I don't really care about it either. What I care about is a creator and whatnot. And the question you have to ask is, was the Bible designed to teach us science in these matters? I mean, there's no biblical Hebrew word for brain. I mean, the locus of your emotions and your intellect are in your kidneys. Hebrews chapter 7, the idea of persons existing in the loins of a male. This is pre-scientific thinking, but God knew what he was doing when he prompted people to write Scripture. He doesn't ask them to change their culture. He doesn't ask them to go get a PhD in the year 2016, and so that they can get this right. That isn't the purpose of the Bible. To talk about these things in this way. Its purpose is different. The third sort of stumbling block is people assume that if there are aliens, they must be demons. Again, why? Why do we have to make these assumptions? And in part, people do that because of the abduction narrative, because it is so sinister. Or the messaging in the contactee era, being very anti-Christian, sort of taking the words of the gospel, the stories of Jesus, and changing all their meanings. Well, that's why people are suspicious. And all these things are demonstrable, but it doesn't have to be this way. This could be a narrative that people are being given so that their beliefs are changed or perverted or diluted. But just the question itself, is there ET or not? That question alone itself doesn't have to be a stumbling block. It doesn't have to trouble people who are very conservative in their beliefs.
Okay. Now, where do you stand on Father Balducci and Funay's of the Vatican Observatory making statements, and I know they're not technically endorsed by the Vatican, but they are Vatican spokespeople, saying that there's most likely, God in his eminence shouldn't be limited to one planet, and there most likely is life in space, and they would be our space brothers and most likely have fallen just like we have. What's your view on life in space and those comments?
Yeah, well, I mean, everything there is of course speculative, but we'll be nice. On the one hand, Balducci's comments are very much in the mainstream, not only of Catholicism, but also other branches of Christianity during from the medieval period on into the 19th century. The church actually had a very positive view of the ET question. And it was because of something theologically that the church called the principle of plenitude. That is, it's wrong to say that God couldn't have created other worlds and other intelligent beings on those worlds, because if you say God couldn't do that, you're impinging on his omnipotence. And so for some theologians, it was actually sort of a requirement to believe in other worlds to hold, a good doctrine of omnipotence, like a high view of God. Now that all changed when it came to the late 19th century with Darwin, and eventually Darwinism gets applied to the ET question, and then we get the contactee stuff, we get the abduction stuff, so that the opinion now has really soured. And I would say on the negative side of Balducci, while his comments could be viewed as very sort of mainstream historically, he needs to move into the 20th and the 21st centuries to know where people are at, and I think he's dramatically underread, he's understudied when it comes to things like the contactee movement, the abduction movement, the sinister nature of the abduction narrative. It's like he's never been exposed to this at all. And I can only conclude that either you're trying to deliberately divert attention from it, which wouldn't be a good thing, wouldn't be ethical, or you're not competent to discuss these things. So it's one or the other.
Well, there are authors out there, and everybody likes to take a shot at Catholicism, but Tom Horn and other authors who claim that the deception, the Antichrist, whatever is going to come through the Vatican, that's part of how we're going to be tricked. So by the Vatican having two observatories, I mean, what are they looking for in space? Why does the Vatican have two observatories? And that when the trick comes, of the Antichrist, it'll come through the ET disclosure question and people wanting to follow, but that will come through the Catholic Church.
Yeah, well, what the Catholic Church is doing, like at Castel Gandolfo, with the observatory, is nothing new. I mean, this isn't new. Like, in the last decade or so, they've been looking for ET. They've been doing astronomy for centuries. Even while Galileo was still alive. There's actually a good bit of documentary evidence that. Even though Galileo's views were condemned, people in the Vatican and in the Catholic elite found them very interesting and very enlightening, actually. But it wasn't something that could be made, public. So the Vatican has been interested in astronomy for centuries. This is nothing new. And to get sort of the Vatican be the main villain, like Tom, and others, and I know Tom, he's a friend of mine. But to get that view, you have to take a very specific perspective on certain things, not only in the book of Revelation, but certain things in the wider scope of biblical prophecy that may or may not be coherent, may or may not be accurate. I have a kind of a different view of biblical prophecy that sort of allows me to rain on everybody's parade. We don't need to rabbit trail into that, but suffice it to say that it takes a pretty narrow lens, through which to view biblical prophecy in the book of Revelation to come out with the Vatican being the villain. Yeah. Now all that said, it's conceivable, it's possible that, let's say tomorrow, somebody at Castel Gandolfo, sees something and it's proof of extraterrestrial life. I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that they'd sit on that for a while. Again, to put the best spin on it they could, because when you do that, it's not necessarily like cosmic evil if you decide to do that, but at the very least, I mean, it could be very evil, but at the very least, we want to get in front of this. We want to control the narrative because we don't want believers, we don't want Christians to get freaked out. And we can draw on a long history of discussion of other worlds within the church. So let's kind of get our ducks in a row, and then we'll say something. So I think at the very least, the Catholic Church wants to be at the forefront of the discussion for that reason. And I think that specific reason is kind of understandable. And they do have a lot of tradition they could draw on to sort of frame the discussion from that point on.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, they probably should have had their PR person take a look at the relationship in Arizona and getting involved with a project called Lucifer. Come on. we should have at least looked at that and said, wait a second, that doesn't look good.
Well, in my novel, The Facade, I have a character, Andrew Benedict, Father Benedict, who was he's a Jesuit and a close associate at one point to the Pope. But he's sort of my nod to Malachi Martin. And many of your listeners will be familiar with Malachi Martin. Martin, of course, believed, and there are others who believe, that within the church there's a cancer within the Catholic Church that is very Luciferian. I personally don't have any trouble believing that. I do think there are reasons to believe that. And so, you could have, something like this association where some will look at it and say, oh, this is kind of a funny thing that we can get some mileage out of as far as, jokes or getting into the press or, have a chuckle here and there. But I think there would be others that would either appreciate the name more intentionally or maybe even try to come up with a name to give it a nod, or at least, that's the way they take the name, to sort of reflect where they're really at. So I think, that the Vatican, this institution which is quite large, I think it does have a certain Luciferian problem within it that, would not be a good thing, would be very contrary to the message of Christ.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about two UFO abductees, and that'll probably wrap it up for us at this point. I want to talk a little bit about Betty Andresian. It's a name that I've seen in so many of the UFO books from the 70s, 80s, referring to her. And actually, the first UFO conference I went to in 1998 in Northern Virginia, she was a speaker there. And I didn't know anything at that time. It was my first conference. But she's one that's referred to so many times. And the reason really is because she was allegedly a devout Christian and one of the few that had this alien contact that really bordered, in my mind, on demonic. A lot of paranormal overtones to her case, a lot of it. So, let me just say a few things, and then you can comment on it. And she did take 2 lie detector tests and passed, so she did believe whatever happened really happened. But she thought that she was in touch with angels. And not originally that was her thought. Ray Fowler, who wrote 5 books on it, really capitalized on it. I've read all 5 of his books and a lot of repeated information in that. He kind of kept pushing it to these are aliens and this is a UFO abduction. But here are the things, Fred, and you tell me what you think. This is what happened to her and her family. Lights blinking on and off, creatures floating to the house, feeling paralyzed, out-of-body experiences, booming voices, the burning death and rebirth of a phoenix, being told she would meet the Son of the One, which she thought meant God's Son being Christ, seeing small headless creatures with red eyes, who I guess the eyes were used to replace the eyes of the grays because they wore out in our environment. Being told or knowing her 2 sons would die, and they actually did die. Seeing a dog-like creature in a room, claw sounds on the floor, creaking, rattling windows, breathing sounds, voices, bed shaking, being taught a hieroglyphic writing that worked in concert with certain tones, but not being told what they meant, which shows up in a few cases, and we can talk about that and what happens with magic. Also, black masses moving, sheets rolling up into a ball, a bicycle riding by itself for an extended period and being parked against a tree. I mean, how does that happen? What does that have to do with aliens? Grays
it sounds like an episode of Poltergeist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Grays and Nordics being involved, telling us that the world's going to become sterile. We got to keep the environment clean, really for them more than for us. And there was more and more to that. And I guess what was probably the most disappointing thing, and it goes back to the second question, why we shouldn't be threatened, is that today Betty and her daughter Becky are into everything paranormal. They're big supporters of supernaturalgirls.com. She got converted. So, that goes back to my question. Here's a devout Christian, but years later, she went to the paranormal side.
Yeah, and I again, that'd be the way I process it too. Again, I separate the question. What if there were genuine extraterrestrials? Is that a theological conundrum for again, conservative Christians and Jews? Again, the answer to that particular question is no. And again, I have whole lectures on this. People can listen to them online and whatnot. But when you're talking about these sorts of specifics, that is a different question. What's happening in the room here to this woman, and what do these things indicate? To me, that's easily parsable as something that is supernaturally sinister. And I wasn't kidding when I said it sounds like poltergeist. Because that, if you've read enough of that kind of material and you read something like that, you could probably pick out 12, 15 elements that are the same with a haunting or with poltergeist activity or demonic possession. To be fair to her, I don't know her, so I can't judge what's going on inside of her head or her heart. She could have expressed faith in Christ and been a serious devout Christian and whatnot. That doesn't mean she's a critical thinker. It doesn't mean that she's processing these things well. I think if you have something traumatic happen to you, the human thing to do is you look for a way to process it. And in her case, and in many people that I've met who are Christians, they really have a fundamental choice to make. Either this thing happened to me and I can't correlate it with my faith or the Bible in any way, so I have to throw out my faith in the Bible and I'm going to go with this. Whereas others will try to marry the two. They'll try to integrate the two. And this is where you come out with the Bible, oh, well, they're the angels, they must be the aliens, and the demons must be the bad alien. You try to marry the two things so that you can process it. It's a very human thing to do, and people do it all the time. Again, under sort of critical thinking analysis, it doesn't mean it's correct. It just means that this is a way that's been helpful for you to process it. And people nowadays, especially, there's so much of this stuff out there. They can read something or have a conversation or watch something on TV, and that becomes part of the way they frame the event, the way they process things. So again, to try to be fair to her, I think that's probably what happened. She latched onto this particular method of coping with this and became friendly to the narrative, and now she's actually part of the narrative, because of what you've said. I would encourage people to go look at the work of people like Leah Haley, who, again, has a Christian profession, was heavily into abduction research, and now she has done a 180, basically saying there are no alien abductions. The aliens aren't doing this. And she processes a lot of her own experience, and frankly, for good reason, if you read her work, with MILABs, the military abductions, or some sort of, I hate to use the word, dissociative, disordered conditioning but given screen memories and that sort of thing, so she's gone the other direction. And again, she has real good reasons for doing so. That's where her research led her. She tried not to let her experience filter out the other ways of processing the event. And I think that's a really honest thing to do. And eventually the data for a more negative parsing of not only her episode, but also the research she was doing, it just led her in a more negative direction. And I think she has a more clear-headed approach to it now, as opposed to letting her feelings or her experience become the filter.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Carla Turner kind of went that same way. I just read her 3 books. And again, she has a PhD, so like people give her more credibility because of the education level, let's say, and she was was a college professor. But I read her first book, Into the Fringe, and she describes everything that happened. And again, I'm very in tune to this demonic side, the paranormal side, because of things that happened to me a year ago. And I look for these markers now in these cases. But,
Sure.
Here she is talking about 3 a.m. in the morning, the banging noises, the bed shaking. Half of the markers she talks about, to me, when it happened to me, I said, Jesus Christ commands you to leave this house. You've never been invited. I called upon God, but I read her, and it stopped. It stopped the attack upon me, which happened about 1 year ago today, right around this same time. Started Thanksgiving week, and it was sometime before Christmas that it escalated. But I read her entire book, happening to her husband, her son, and never once, and this is in a lot of cases also, did they ask for any spiritual help to ward this off. And from Joe Jordan, with his book, many UFO abduction counters by this gray alien sitting next to me here, I don't think you can see it, we have one in the studio here, it was repelled by the person calling upon their deity to stop it. Why does an alien back off at the name of Jesus Christ? It's an important question that you see come up. It comes up in demonic attacks and alien abductions.
Yeah, and in Joe's case, I don't know what the number is now, but the last time I saw him was, I don't know, a number of years ago in Roswell. He's at that time he had over 100, of these. So I don't know if he's continued on specifically, with clients. To take that number higher, but that's significant, and it does beg this question. Well, why the response and all this? I mean, for myself personally, when it comes to the alien abduction thing, I think there are a number of buckets that this can go into. A lot of these things that are described by people are classic sleep paralysis kinds of things, and I don't think sleep paralysis is in and of itself a supernatural, sinister sort of thing. I think it's a brain phenomenon. People do it under lab conditions, and there's lots of research for this. That could be exploited, by a spiritual presence. I think there could be a connection there. But you got that. You've got other sort of brain phenomena that it could be. In my mind, a demonic, situation, a demonic visitation, that's on the table, because again, I believe, I'm a supernaturalist. I believe in a supernatural world, and I don't believe that because the Bible forces me to do that. I believe, biblical ideas like that are put forth in the Bible have held up to philosophical scrutiny for millennia. So it has a pretty good track record as far as its own coherence. You could throw the Bible out and still come to that view. But then there's this other category, aliens. Well, to me, the alien explanation for an abduction doesn't get on the table until I know there are aliens. And what I mean by that is it's not legitimate to use one unknown, are there aliens, as proof of another unknown, what happened in this room.
Yeah, but
it's patently illogical.
What the people do, and we're almost out of time here, is they do see a craft, and then they associate that with being from outer space. But I have said, well, if you see a boat, does that mean the boat came from under the water? It doesn't necessarily mean that. But Michael, we're out of time right now. We got to wrap it up. We will have you out to one of our Pennsylvania conferences, hopefully the symposium, to talk about why we shouldn't be afraid of ET contact, and we'll get you out here. And thank you for being on our show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd love to come to PA.
You will. And that'll be close to Lebanon, so you might be able to see family. So, all right, thank you, Michael.
Thank you.